All right, the third session of this conference promises to be a very thought-provoking one. We have three outstanding scholars with us, not only three great scholars, but three great friends and colleagues. And of course, we will start with Professor Clint Walker, from the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and his presentation will focus, of course, on Russia and Soviet Union, and I look very much forward to that presentation because you are a treasure house of information and analysis. Then we follow with our good colleague and friend, Dexter Roberts, and he was for a long time living in China, analyzing Chinese politics and economic issues, and having listened to Tiff, for at least on several occasions in person, but also on the radio, I'm always educated. So about how complex the Chinese society is and China's relationship with the rest of the world is. And finally, after the two speakers, we have our very good friend and colleague, past president of Montana World Affairs Council and a visiting scholar at the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, my very good friend Bob Seidenschwarz, and he will basically wrap it up with a sort of a take on the financial and economic issues confronting the world as a result of China and Russia's role in world politics. So with no further ado, please welcome this outstanding panel.
Hi. So I primarily teach language, literature, and culture, and I'm going to try to attempt to present some broad background for where Russia is right now, maybe, and how it got there, and how we got into the situation where we are now with the different elements that are going on in the world that we will touch on as we go through. I want to look at this from a large background perspective and kind of from a more zooming in perspective. So start with three Vladimirs, or Volodymyr. Prince Vladimir, or Volodymyr, the Christianizer, baptizer of the Rus nations, who consolidated the Slavic tribes and what would be present-day Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, right? Used religion as a means to cement and to make those tribes come together. And it was in 988 AD that first Prince Volodymyr was, according to the chronicles, baptized at Chersones, which is present-day Crimea, and then he went back to baptize his entire nation in the in Kiev. The second Vladimir, probably maybe even the most familiar, would be Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the famous father of the Soviet Union, Russian Revolution, October Revolution, right? And obviously that's 1917, and the Soviet Union, we remember, lasted until 1991. Gorbachev resigned as the first and last president of the Soviet Union. And that was on December 25th, 1991. I was there in the Soviet Union at the time and watched it on television. And in order to insult him, Yeltsin had it specially ordered that Gorbachev would not be brought his ceremonial tea after finishing his speech, peacefully resigning as the first and last president of the Soviet Union. So that was the end of the Soviet Union, and that event Putin famously called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the third Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who, remember this date, was born on October 7th, 1952. October 7th resonates today for very different reasons, but October 7th for Putin would resonate as well, and we'll get to that. But Putin, of course, not many people know this, but Putin lost what would have been an older brother in the blockade during World War II, starved to death. The siege of Leningrad, where the city was surrounded for almost 900 days, and nearly 1 million people starved to death. And 20 to 30 million Soviets died in that war. And so for Putin, the legacy of World War II is huge, the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it. And then there's a fourth Vladimir that we're going to, Volodymyr Zelensky, the sixth president of Ukraine, right, who had formerly been a comedian, had performed and was very popular with Russians, did many performances in Russian, was a comic, was starred in many movies, tended to speak Russian more than Ukrainian early on, and ended up creating a television show through his own studio that he founded, a television studio. It was called Kvartal 95, Block 95, and they made up a story about a history teacher who becomes president of Ukraine running on anti-corruption. And 4 years later, after starting this series, there was Vladimir Zelensky running for president, and the party that they had created in the TV show, Servant of the People, became a real political party in real life, Zelensky's party, and it brought him into the presidency. So we want to remember some of these things. And he's, again, the sixth president. Ukraine has existed as an independent country since August 24th, 1991. It was a little bit before the Soviet Union collapsed, but already on the way of collapsing. Ukraine declared its independence. And so that's generally the beginning of the nation. I mentioned Crimea, I mentioned Khersones, and this is the place where in Crimea, Volodymyr, the prince, in 988, was baptized, and so became Russian Orthodox and adopted Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Eastern branch of Christianity. This is important. It's one of the reasons, and a lot of people don't understand this, but this is there are many reasons why Putin wanted Crimea back that had been gifted to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in the 50s. Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and but Putin wanted it back for many reasons, and many of the people who lived in Crimea really also wanted to rejoin Russia because anywhere from, depending on which statistics you're reading, 80 to 90% of Crimea was Russian-speaking and self-identified as Russian. That, of course, did not give Vladimir Putin internationally the right to annex it and add it back to Russia, but that is what he did. He violated international law. He had elections, but it was occupied at the time militarily. But Crimea was annexed and added back to Russia, and there was a vote, and around 98%, maybe even as many as 99% of those who took part in the election voted to rejoin Russia. That was 2014, and if we remember, it was happening, it started, the invasion, during Russia's very successful Sochi Winter Olympics, when Russia was winning very, very many medals, and the international community was occupied with that. But Putin was frustrated and had been expressing this frustration for many, many years. He was frustrated with many, many things. And this spilled over pretty early as 2007 at the Munich National Security Conference. He went through a whole list of a laundry list of things that he was really frustrated with the way that the West was treating Russia, ostracizing Russia, isolating Russia, from his perspective, interfering in elections in areas near Russia that Russia saw as part of its home territory, this happened in Ukraine, and this happened in Georgia, and so this is from, I'm trying to help understand, this is the Russian perspective on some of these events. Also, NATO was expanding extremely rapidly. When the Soviet Union broke up, just prior to that, there were discussions by the United States, James Baker, Secretary of State, many promises were made in letters and orally and in letters in writing that the NATO would not be expanded, that after, if the Soviet Union were to disband, NATO would not be expanded, and not a single inch was what James Baker said famously, would it be expanded to the east. At that time, there were 16 members of NATO. Initially, there were 12, and I'll go into that a bit if I have time. Anyway, so that was another thing, that NATO now is 32 members, so it has doubled since basically 1999, when Putin has been in power. This is now Putin's, we remember, 5th term as Russian president, and the terms now are for 6 years, right? So he's been elected five times, and the first 2 terms were for 4 years, and then he had to step down, and Dmitry Medvedev, his former prime minister, became president. Putin stepped into prime minister for 4 years, and then they changed the constitution. Putin ran again. Putin won, was elected for another 2 terms, and then they changed the constitution so that the terms were 6 years, and now Putin is president for another 6 years term. By the way, he won in a landslide with a 77% voter turnout, if you can imagine in the United States having a 77% voter turnout. And 88% of the voters voted for Putin as president. And there were 4 other candidates. So why Crimea? Well, I talked about the religious reasons. It's access to the sea. The Russian Navy is very dependent on access to the sea through Azov and the Black Sea to get into the Mediterranean. And Ukraine really controlled most of those access points, right? So, so that's another major factor here that we need to think about. But now we jump a bit ahead. This is to give us an idea of what's happening now, what's been happening in this now 3 years of war that's been going on. We see that Crimea was annexed in, at the very bottom part in 2014. And then from that point on, there were Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, and certain elements of Zaporozhye and Kherson. They wanted to, many of them wanted independence from Ukraine because they felt like they were being discriminated against. They either wanted Ukraine to allow them to be independent, or they wanted Russia to absorb them. They wanted to join Russia. This wasn't all of the people who lived in those areas, but Eastern Ukraine was much more dominated by people who self-identified as Russian speakers, tended to speak Russian at home, and maybe many of them might have even identified, and still do today now, especially as Russians. But they, the Ukraine itself kind of was split, almost east and west, a western part of Ukraine that was much more oriented toward the west and wanted to join the EU and wanted to, hoping to join even like maybe NATO, still does, right? And eastern Ukraine that identified much more with Russia and wanting to stay close to Russia. And the 6 presidents that have been president of Ukraine have basically flip-flopped back and forth as to whether they've been pro-Russian or more pro-European. Yanukovych was from Donetsk, and he was president, and he was actually the Maidan uprisings forced him to flee the country. Eventually, Poroshenko became president, but the country has been flip-flopping back and forth in terms of, of presidents and sort of loyalties. Let's see. So here's just a reminder of how large the Soviet Union was, and 15 different republics that are now all independent countries, right? And that's also, again, where Putin is coming from. This is another reminder of the importance of Crimea. This is the Livadia Palace in Yalta, in Crimea. And this was one of the most important areas post-World War II, where, well, World War II was technically still going on, but they were already working out how they were going to deal with the end of World War II. And again, for Putin, this is all very, very important, the legacy of World War II and Russia's participation in that, the Soviet Union. I mentioned NATO. I mentioned the NATO expansion. NATO was founded, so there are two main dates that we want to think about in relation to things that are happening today. One is 1945 and the aftermath. What happened? Well, obviously, the US and the Soviet Union won the war. We were allies in that war, right? But Russia lost 20 to 30, the Soviet Union lost 20 to 30 million people. The United States lost around 420,000 in comparison, right? So in the aftermath, Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in the United States in '46, and that kind of is seen as the start of the Cold War. There was a real paranoia that the Soviet Union and Stalin really wanted to expand and they needed to be contained. And George Kennan came up with the containment policy. He said that the Soviet Union, he advised in '46, the Soviet Union needed to be contained. And he also felt that Europe needed to be rebuilt so it would be stronger and could become a close ally of the United States as insurance also against the Soviet Union potential expansion. And so they created in 1949, April 4th, 1949, they created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was initially 12 member states, and they were, the idea was security against what was perceived as a Soviet Union that was aggressive and they felt wanted to expand, and so therefore we needed security against that, and so we created NATO. Not long after, so another thing about the aftermath of World War II was Germany. What do you do with Nazi Germany? Initially, Nazi Germany was broken into 4 zones, and the United States took 2 of those zones in the west of Germany and consolidated them and created a new country, the country of West Germany. That was in May of 1949. And so the Soviets, what we get now with the Cold War, if you don't know it that well, or just don't remember all of the events, and I had to look back at some of these myself, it's very eye-opening to go back. West Germany was created again May '49, so the Soviets took their 2 parts in East Germany, put them together, and created basically the nation of East Germany as a counterbalance. That was the date of the founding of East Germany, the Democratic Republic of Germany, was October 7th, 1949. Who remembers in the audience who was born on October 7th, 1952? Who? Putin, exactly. So that meant every time he had his birthday, East Germany was celebrating its anniversary of its creation. And of course, Putin knew this, and Putin grew up in this atmosphere. Remember, he lost his older brother in the blockade. He had this real sense of being connected to East Germany because he was born on the same day that it was founded. So what did he do? He joined the KGB. He wanted to serve his country and be an agent. He was really into spy novels. And there he is. Guess where he decided to go and be stationed as a KGB agent? East Germany. And guess who was there stationed in East Germany in 1989 when the wall fell and came down? Or I shouldn't say fell, was taken down. Putin. Putin was there, and Putin was very scared when it was happening, although he took charge. He didn't run away, but he was called back afterwards because he needed a new assignment. And of course, Germany was very quickly reunified, right? Gorbachev allowed that to happen. There wasn't really bloodshed. There could have been massive bloodshed, but Gorbachev, having been given those promises that NATO would not be expanded in 1990 repeatedly, Gorbachev gave the okay for the reunification of Germany, and he was promised Germany will never represent a threat to Russia. We're going to have a new world order, and Russia's going to be integrated into that world order, and Russia's going to be a major partner in that world order. We'll have new institutions, international ones, that will involve Russia as a main player. That's what Russia was told over and over again in those talks. So, and that was under George Bush, and James Baker was the one who famously said, not an inch eastward. So, like I said, that wasn't what happened. NATO massively expanded, and Ukraine was one of the last countries, still has not joined NATO, but now that NATO is 32 countries, it's double the size. Putin had said many times at different points, no more expansion. Russia feels threatened. Our security feels threatened. There's no reason for this. We aren't trying to attack Germany. NATO really should have been disbanded. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the counterbalance to NATO. Why do you even need a NATO, was Putin's argument. And earlier on, Putin had even advocated maybe we could join NATO and then it wouldn't be a threat to us. But Putin was continually put off early on in his presidency. And I would also add that Putin was one of the first to call George Bush, First Nations, on 9/11 and ask, what can we do? How can we help? We will share all of our intel about terrorist cells with you. We want this to stop. We want to help. And over time, Russia really was repaid by being ostracized. So, 2 books I would recommend if you want to read more about some of these contexts that I've talked about. One is called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. Both these books came out around 1997. Huntington is from Harvard, brilliant, was a major foreign advisor, and brilliant man. But he was writing in this book about basically a world that was becoming multipolar. And one of his main arguments was the U.S. should not try to be directing this. We should not be trying to have a hegemonic single view. We need to not see ourselves as trying to export our civilization to everyone else. We need to be aware that the world is multipolar, and it's going to continue to be more and more multipolar. Huntington did say that this would probably lead to a clash of civilizations because of the different value sets, but that the way to handle this from Huntington's view was not through hegemony and just U.S. leadership. It was through creating more multinational new organizations in the world. But his view really didn't win out in terms of a plan. The plan for action was taken from this national security advisor under Jimmy Carter, who went on to advise many, many presidents, both Democrats and Republican, and taught at Johns Hopkins and raised an entire new future generation of diplomats. One of his students was Madeleine Albright, who would go on to become Secretary of State under, I'm trying to remember, Clinton it was, yes. But the Grand Chessboard basically argues that the U.S. needs to establish hegemony. It needs to take charge. Brzezinski felt that the fall of the Soviet Union and its collapse left a big vacuum, and that it was the responsibility and the duty of the United States to take on the leadership of the entire world on its shoulders. And he wanted, as part of that plan, massive expansion of NATO. And he also talked about the need to incorporate into NATO Georgia and Ukraine. And he was making these arguments in 1997 already. And if you read through this book, The Grand Chessboard, which is obviously the idea of playing chess and the world politics as a kind of a chess game, right? It reads like a game plan of what actually happened. And the Russians that I've read many articles about, they quote this book all the time, and they understand very well that this book really became a kind of blueprint for American foreign policy, particularly with regard to Russia, but in general. Triumphalism won out. Instead of what George Bush said, we don't want to have triumphalism. We don't want to make Russia feel like it's not important or not included. We want a new world order where Russia's integrated. That didn't win out. That view, over time, Russia was alienated. There are many reasons for this. I could go into many details about, you think about an organization like NATO, it needed a reason to exist. And of course, it wanted to grow. Any organization doesn't want to remain the same size. It wants to grow. So, but I don't want to take up too much time, but I can't recommend enough reading this book. It's really eye-opening, The Grand Chessboard. So NATO expanded. Here's NATO today, 32 states, and you can see the waves of expansion. The biggest waves, 1999 and then 2004. Those waves of expansion, by the way, George Kennan, who had been the architect of containment, right, back in 1947, he said, those Soviets, they're dangerous. They want to dominate the world. We need a containment policy, and he helped even create NATO, really. He came out in a very famous New York Times article in 1999, and he said, expansion of NATO is a very bad idea. It's going to have horrendous consequences. Russia's going to feel very threatened, and it's going to lead to wars, and it's going to lead to clashes and confrontations. And we can avoid this if we just don't give in to that temptation to expand NATO. And again, this is the author of Containment. He wasn't listened to, unfortunately, and again, the Brzezinski plan was the one that actually was acted on, and it made Putin very angry and frustrated, and that's really partially where we are today. So NATO is now 76 years old. This is its 75th anniversary poster, which was last year, and you see what's the focus? Who's the main enemy? Oh, there he is, Putin, right? And of course, Zelensky, to emphasize the idea that the whole Russia-Ukraine war is really all about the West and defeating this tyrant figure. There are a lot of things about Putin that I don't like, but I also feel he's one of the most misunderstood and often intentionally so by the United States and Europe, one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented figures in history. And I'm not a huge, I'll lay my cards on the table, so to speak. I'm not a huge Donald Trump fan either, but in terms of what he's doing to try to reestablish relations with Russia, it's one of the best possible things that could happen for world security. And the idea that world security, in my opinion, relies on something like NATO is just misconceived. But that's my opinion. Last couple things, I know I'm probably going too long. Yeah, I just wanted to talk, and these will probably be touched on more later. So G7, right? The seven global leaders, right? Extremely important economic issues, and the countries that are part of the G7. Russia was allowed to join, and for a short time became the G8, but when Putin invaded Crimea, Russia was kicked out of the G8. And what that made Russia really start to want to have a different economic collective that he could have as a counterbalance. BRICS already existed, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. But it's growing and growing, and Putin has pivoted in two ways. One, he wants to substantially expand the power of BRICS, which is now economically and by population and by geography much, much larger than the G7. And he probably wants to weaken the dollar. He doesn't want to get rid of the dollar, I don't think, as a standard currency, but I'll let other people more expert than myself talk about that. But BRICS, this is a map about BRICS and how much it's growing, and you see the blue, you see how much of the world is now represented by BRICS in terms of the percentage of the population, 42%, and it's a very large chunk of the market now, too. And the other thing is, obviously everyone knows, Putin has very clearly pivoted to China and the East. Well, the idea being, if the West won't have us, we'll gather together with the others and we'll pivot to the East. And with that, I end. Thank you.
So I'm, as in the kind introduction by Emeritus, he mentioned that I was a resident in China for many years. I'm not sure he mentioned I was a journalist there. And although I haven't been a journalist for a number of years, I still write, and I like to think like a journalist. I'm actually going to talk today mainly about the news and about the news of a potential trade war between the U.S. and China, and also the possibility of the reverse, some sort of big deal between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Certainly Trump has made clear that he wants to pursue a deal with China. He said that repeatedly. Before I do that, though, I wanted to quote something that Xi Jinping said that none of us were ever supposed to hear. It was in December of 2012. He had just been named the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in the fall, I think in October of 2012, and had risen to the very heights of, at that point, of the Chinese political system. He was not even yet the president. He was going to get his state role. China has a party system and a state system. He was going to get his state role as president of China in March of 2012. So he very much was just beginning in power. There was the assumption, like his predecessors, and I watched both of them in my years reporting there, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, or two of his previous predecessors, that he would take some time to assert himself. And he surprised all of us by moving very, very quickly, started a signature anti-corruption campaign even earlier, right after becoming General Secretary. December 2012, he's in Shenzhen. He's giving an internal speech to the People's Liberation Army. not supposed to be heard. It leaked. The person who leaked it went to jail, a woman named I think it was Galyu, who did that. So what did he say during that speech? Interestingly, the speech was all about the collapse of the Soviet Union. To quote Xi Jinping, "Why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Why did the Soviet Communist Party collapse? An important reason was that their ideals and beliefs had been shaken. In the end, quote, the ruler's flag over the city tower, unquote, changed overnight. It's a profound lesson for us to dismiss the history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party, to dismiss Lenin and Stalin, and to dismiss everything else is to engage in historical nihilism." And Xi Jinping makes that a theme for years up until today, the dangers of historical nihilism. "And it confuses our thoughts and undermines the party's organization on all levels." And then he finished a little bit later. "Yeltsin gave a speech standing on a tank, but the military made no response, keeping so-called, quote, neutrality. Finally, Gorbachev announced the disbandment of the Soviet Communist Party in a blithe statement. A big party was gone just like that. Proportionally, the Soviet Communist Party had more members than we do, but nobody was man enough," and he used a very sort of macho phrase, "was man enough to stand up and resist." In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Chinese theorists and working for the government and the party spent enormous amounts of time trying to understand why the Soviet Union collapsed and what lessons there were to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party would never collapse. And of course, it's still going strong. Another thing of note, well, first of all, I think as we've seen in repeated speeches and meetings between the two, of Xi Jinping and Putin, they both admire what they see as being manliness in each other, and the fact that both of them are ready to step forward at key moments and basically rescue their countries as they view it. One interesting other thing I would mention, on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, early 2022, where was Putin? Well, Putin was for at least a number of days in Beijing attending the Beijing Olympics. He had a private meeting with Xi Jinping, left a few days later and moved the tanks into Ukraine and invaded. So a question that a lot of people have wondered about, we don't know the answer, is did he tell Xi Jinping? Did he get a nod from Xi Jinping about the move into Ukraine? I find it very hard to believe, even though we don't know the answer, that Xi Jinping was not at least aware, maybe didn't give approval, but at least said, we'll stand back on this one. As we know, since then, China has been a key supporter in trade mainly, a lot of energy trade with Russia, and has been very, very important for Russia as other countries around the world have imposed sanctions on them. So I wanted to talk about the news again, and the news is, first of all, there's some interesting news relevant to all of us here in Montana. Probably a lot of you saw that Senator Steve Daines was in China last week. On the 23rd of March, he met with the Premier, a gentleman named Premier Li Qiang, and they discussed a lot of things, including China's efforts to try to stop the flow of precursor fentanyl elements into Mexico to the cartels, and then fentanyl into the U.S. They also spoke about the possibility of a Xi Jinping-Donald Trump meeting. Steve Daines went to the White House and met with Trump within a week and a half, within 2 weeks before he went to China, and they talked about the possibility of a Donald Trump and Xi Jinping meeting sometime soon. Donald Trump has been saying for a while, President Trump has been saying he wanted to meet Xi Jinping in the first month he was president. Well, he's not doing that, we know now. He repeatedly over the years has expressed real admiration for Xi Jinping. He's referred to him as a friend. He's also, interestingly, referenced with almost envy the autocratic powers of Xi Jinping. So that's the background of that. Onto the news. Tomorrow we have what Donald Trump referred to recently as Liberation Day, Tariff Liberation Day. We're going to see a lot of tariffs levied on a lot of countries around the world, and we'll probably see tariffs levied on China as well. That very possibly is going to push back the likelihood of a Xi Jinping-Donald Trump meeting for a while, as well as a possible deal. Having said that, there are a lot of reasons why both countries, China and the United States, would like to dial it down a bit in this tit-for-tat tariff war that seems to be brewing. First, with China, China has a very difficult economic situation at home. They never really properly recovered from some of the restrictions that were put in place during COVID. In particular, consumer confidence has not returned to China. China has a long-time goal of trying to move to a more household consumption reliant economy, and that's just not happening now. The situation is particularly bad in some of the localities of China where we've seen local governments are actually, in some cases, struggling to pay pensions that they're responsible, in some cases struggling to pay civil servant salaries. And I think the last thing that China wants right now is a raging trade war as a distraction from trying to deal with some of the challenges that they have at home. At the same time, China over the last year's economy has been very reliant, again, not on consumption, which is what they would like to see, on the spending power of the Chinese people. It's been reliant on investment and on exports, actually. It's been very reliant on exports. So another reason why China is not eager to see a real trade war. What about U.S. President Donald Trump and the United States? What are some of the reasons why some kind of deal would be good? Well, there's a lot of them. Inflation. And of course, China is just one piece of this, but we have a very large trading relationship. We buy a tremendous amount of our goods from China, and tariffs on China and tariffs back on us are going to contribute to, very potentially to, well, tariffs that we put on their products will contribute to inflation here in the U.S. It's almost certain. We've heard from some U.S. officials that won't happen, and particularly Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said repeatedly that the Chinese will eat the tariffs, to quote him, or they will eat the costs. Most economists don't think that's actually how it works. So one problem with a trade war is inflation for all of us here. Another problem is the stock markets, which haven't been doing very well for a lot of reasons. But being engaged in a full-on trade war with China is not going to help them either. Let's see here. What else did I have on my list here? I mean, finally, a real obvious one. You know, the U.S. president obviously prides himself on deal-making. We've heard that from him. And for him to pull off a big deal and even a summit with Xi Jinping, I think he would see as very good in its own right, not just economically, but politically, to have that deal. So those are all things that the U.S. would like. What does each side have to offer the other? And I'm going to get to why there's real reasons why a deal may not happen and a trade war may happen instead. But what are some of the reasons, what are some of the things that each side could give the other? China, first of all, well, both sides need to dial down on the tariffs and the tariff threats. So stop adding new tariffs. That's the first, most basic prerequisite for any sort of trade deal. Purchase orders. China buys a lot of stuff from the U.S., including lots of agricultural products, as you probably know, and real relevance here to the state of Montana. And so China could dial up the agricultural purchases. They've been trying to diversify as the U.S.-China relationship has gotten worse. For example, soybeans. They used to buy a lot from the U.S., including from our neighbors in North Dakota. Now they're buying a lot from Brazil. So China could buy a lot of agricultural products. They could buy a lot of energy and a lot of sort of big ticket purchase items like Boeing airplanes, which China's bought a lot of Boeing airplanes over the years. So that would be easy. They could tell Trump and the American people they're not going to devalue their currency, the yuan. They could pledge to keep buying U.S. treasuries, and they are, you know, the #1 buyer of U.S. treasuries. They could, and this is one that came up very much in the meeting between Senator Daines and Premier Li Qiang. They could try to find a way to crack down more on the sales of these fentanyl precursors that are indirectly fueling, awful devastation here in the United States. That may be, I don't know how hard that is, but that's something that clearly, Daines also made clear when he was there that had to happen for a trade deal to happen. So on the other side, what can the U.S. provide China? There's been threats to end something called permanent normal trade status, which was the successor to most favored nation status. I think Molinar has proposed a bill to take it away from China. It was taken away from Russia, I believe, during the Ukrainian invasion. That would be very devastating. It would allow the U.S. to punish the Chinese economy and take away put a lot more tariffs on. It would justify that. The U.S. could potentially start to slow down all the new technology restrictions. Under Biden, it started mainly with semiconductors, advanced semiconductor chips and equipment, and it's grown and grown. So everything from quantum computing and on is now potentially subject to investment restrictions, and that's both part of that's banning U.S. companies from investing into Chinese companies that do this. The big one that Trump is still talking about and is also in the news is a potential deal on TikTok. If you recall, a law was passed, signed by Biden, that bans TikTok in the United States if a foreign buyer of TikTok, the U.S. subsidiary, is not found. And so the Chinese ownership has to drop to below 20%. That came into effect on January 19th, and Trump came into assumed the presidency and immediately signed or ordered a 75-day reprieve to allow TikTok to continue to operate. TikTok actually, you might not know this unless you have a teenage child, which I do, but TikTok actually vanished for about 12 hours or something. It went dark, and then they restarted it and sent out a glowing thanks to President Trump for the reprieve. But anyway, that expires on April 5th. So either a buyer comes forward, and it could be Microsoft or Oracle, and buys up this U.S. TikTok subsidiary. The parent company, ByteDance, which is in Beijing, based in Beijing, has to own less than 20%. Or Trump, as he's already indicated, he may just extend the reprieve for TikTok. So that's another one. What else could the U.S. offer? Interestingly, Trump on the campaign trail, I think the first time in Ohio, actually talked about allowing Chinese auto companies to invest, presumably electric vehicle Chinese auto companies, to invest into the United States and create jobs. And I'm not so sure that's a terrible idea, but that was not being considered under the previous Biden administration. Under the Biden administration, 100% tariffs were put on Chinese EVs, and much higher than, for example, the European Union, which the tariffs at their highest go up to about 33%, I think, 35%. So Trump did actually say, I don't have a problem with them coming here if they're creating jobs. So he potentially could follow through with that and allow, so this is something the Chinese companies would be very interested in doing, investing, setting up factories here in the US. And then you've got a really big one, which is a little bit scary from my perspective, and that would be some sort of deal where the U.S. Told China that they would sort of stand back a little bit on Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, is the flashpoint from Beijing's perspective, the unresolved piece of the Chinese Civil War. They see it as their own and they want it back. And Xi Jinping has made it clear in various speeches that he wants that to happen during his lifetime. And so Trump has sort of indicated that he's not so sure how important Taiwan is. He's threatened tariffs on them. He accused them of stealing our semiconductor industry. And so there's a possibility of that. That's something China would be very, very pleased with and very thankful for. If they could get the U.S. to say, dial back on the weapons sales to Taiwan, somehow don't be such an obstacle to our eventual resolution of what we see as this unfinished piece of Chinese history, which means bringing back Taiwan into the fold. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things that make this very difficult. First of all, Liberation Day, tomorrow. Liberation Day is a problem. If the U.S. slaps new tariffs on China, they're going to do exactly what they did in February and March, which is retaliate right away. So China's now twice has slapped tariffs back in response to Trump's tariffs, affecting, by the way, beef, pork, fruit, wheat, things that soybeans, things that have some relevance to the economy here in where we all are. So that's a big problem. Whereas the U.S. has been signaling in some ways, when they do signal, the message is not always clear, but they have made some statements that suggest that they're going to get tough on China. And Trump has moved to try to strengthen some of the tech restrictions on China. They have a couple hawks in the administration. Marco Rubio has a long record, the Secretary of State, of being, from the Chinese perspective, hostile towards China. He's one of a very few, of a couple dozen Americans that are formally banned by announcement of the Foreign Ministry of China that they cannot enter the country, which will be interesting to see how China deals with that when there is the occasion for Marco Rubio to go representing the State Department. And Mike Walls, who's struggling a little bit now, maybe. Maybe he should be more careful with his signal. But he's also someone who said that China and the U.S. are engaged in a Cold War, and he's been very tough on China. So those people would not necessarily, and there's others as well, certainly in the U.S. Congress, that have strong feelings about China and about the Chinese Communist Party, and they wouldn't necessarily welcome a big deal. As I said, on the Chinese side, China's also become much tougher in the relationship. They have gotten in the habit of responding almost instantaneously when the U.S. levies tariffs. I think they feel like during Trump 1, they were a little too slow to do it, and they were starting to be viewed as a pushover. So now every time the U.S. imposes tariffs, China responds. They have also done something recently, which we've seen a lot over the years, which is put pressure on the many American corporations that do a lot of business in China. The latest was Walmart. So we have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying, prices aren't going to go up. Walmart's not going to raise prices. They're going to make sure the Chinese suppliers pay that. So apparently Walmart had a meeting with some Chinese suppliers and said, you got to do your part. We're going to have to pay you less because and so on, particularly if tariffs go up. The market regulatory agency in China called in Walmart for a lecture, and they said, very recently, in the last 2 weeks, and said, you are doing something that potentially has legal consequences. First of all, you're maybe breaking contracts with your suppliers if you try to push them around this way. And secondly, you may be disrupting the market, which is a crime in China. And so they're not going to sit around and let, for example, Chinese suppliers be pushed into taking less money for the products they sell if tariffs do go up. The other thing, even as Daines was meeting meeting Premier Li Qiang, Xi Jinping met a bunch of companies, U.S. companies and foreign companies a few days later, said very nice things about how China was open to them. The very same week, China was beefing up some of its arsenal of laws that can be used to retaliate against Western companies, foreign companies, American companies. One is something called the Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law, which they passed a few years ago. They put out 22 new provisions about just what sort of actions by a foreign company. And this would be a foreign company that's trying to follow a sanctions law overseas. So, for example, we have a law that bans companies from sourcing potentially from slave labor from Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims are, which Marco Rubio, by the way, was the main sponsor of and brought that to fruition. Now in China, with this expanded anti-foreign sanctions law, if you end up doing that, you're breaking Chinese law, and you can get in a lot of trouble there. So there are these things that are real challenges to any sort of deal. But we've seen recently that it's a little bit hard to predict what's going to happen next in our country. So I think there is still very much the possibility that we could see a dramatic about-face, which would see Xi Jinping and Donald Trump meeting at some point this year, and a great lessening of tariffs. Keep in mind as well, during the campaign, Trump kept talking about putting 60% tariffs on China. Well, now he's put 20% tariffs on them, and Canada and Mexico are our targets, right? So you don't really know what to expect going forward.
So I'm looking at, we've got a 4:45 kind of closure, so time will not allow for me to kind of go into the depth and detail. So what I want to do right now is open up some questions. We can focus a little bit on the economic side, address some questions to our two speakers here. So please, for the minutes that we have left, questions from the audience.
Yes, for Professor Walker, I'm interested in why Russia feels threatened by NATO, and if those concerns you believe are realistic.
That's a good question, yeah.
Go, please.
Can you hear me from here if I just talk?
Better.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I do think he feels threatened. I think that Russia has always felt that way about NATO. They really, when they disbanded the Warsaw Pact, they had a hope, I think, that NATO would also be disbanded, and they did try to make that argument, and the U.S. just didn't buy it, and I don't blame the United States for not wanting to disband NATO. But they definitely feel very threatened by the, they feel like they have been targeted in many ways, right? NATO has become, Russia has become the reason for NATO's existence, again, continued, but also a rationale to explain why NATO is being expanded, like there's this threat. And even the rhetoric coming out of the European leaders now is still that Russia plans to attack France, Russia plans to attack, Britain. I just find that very, very hard to imagine. There's been no gesture on Putin's part that suggests he has any intention of attacking any other country. The reason he invaded Ukraine, the reason he annexed Crimea, and also the reason why he invaded Ukraine is complex, but a large part of it has to do with the fact, and he said this repeatedly, that after the fall of the Soviet Union, 30 million Russians immediately found themselves without a country located in 14 other countries that weren't Russia. There were 30 million people who identified as Russians and were native Russian speakers who, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were in countries where Russian was no longer the main language spoken there. And pretty rapidly, those Russians were told, either you learn the languages of those countries or you will face discrimination. In some cases, you will not be allowed to vote, many, many different things, right? Many of these people were very old, and for them to learn a completely new language at that stage would have been extremely difficult, and just the rapidity with which it was carried out. And so the problem is complex, but Putin did speak very clearly, repeatedly, that he felt a need that these native speakers would need to be somehow protected because their rights were being violated. And he brought this up again and again, hoping that the United Nations would do something to address the discrimination against those Russian native speakers in different countries. And really nothing was done. And Russia would say, well, why when minorities are being discriminated against in other countries, if it's not a Russian, why is the UN really concerned and immediately begins to take action? And yet if it's Russians who are being discriminated against, it's allowed and not much is done. And so in the case of Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, they were, after the annexation of Crimea, they basically said, we also are massively being discriminated against, and they asked Putin either do something to help us not be discriminated against, be an advocate for us, or help us get independence, or else, you know, absorb us back into the Russian Empire, because we can't live in this Ukraine where we're, I mean, there were over 8 years from 1914 to the beginning of the special military operation, there were as many as 15,000 people on both sides who were killed fighting, including children. Schools were attacked, hospitals were attacked, and not much was being done, and they had these Minsk Accords that were going on that were supposed to settle this. Eventually, Putin found out that Angela Merkel and the people who were participating in the Minsk Accords from Germany and France, they admitted publicly after the fact that they had no intention at all of having the Minsk Accords lead to anything. They were just stalling for time because they wanted time to arm the Ukrainians and militarize and give the Ukrainians weapons so that they would win if Russia did anything.
Clint, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How does that, still I'm struggling with this, because you've had a country that we typically try to settle things in a more civilized fashion, negotiations, conferences. So when one country invades another, almost 1 million people have died on both sides, 500,000, whatever the numbers are. I'm really trying to understand how that, regardless of what's being said, is the proper way to deal with our differences when we really destroy generations of people in Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, I should be clear. I don't want people to get the idea that I'm somehow an advocate of Putin and the war. I disagreed with the special military operation. I came out speaking out against it in the media. I was interviewed by various television stations, and I was very clear. I support Zelensky. Ukraine has an absolute right to its independence, its sovereignty. Putin is interfering with that, and he shouldn't be attacking militarily. The problem is that I think Russia's perspective on everything that's been going on has not been allowed to reach the mainstream media. It's basically been shut out. Ask yourself this, how many times have you heard in news broadcasts in the United States direct quotes from Putin or Russian leaders, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov? How many times under Joe Biden or Obama, both of which I supported and voted for, but how many times did you hear in the media Russian perspective to be allowed to be heard, right? Russia had many, many valid gripes with the way it was being treated and the way Russian speakers were being treated that just weren't being addressed. And it was going on for many, many times. And so eventually, I think it just reached for Putin a point where he said, okay, I either have to act or nothing is ever going to be done. 8 years, right? And you're right, this is a horrendous war. It shouldn't have happened. I would like it to end as quickly as possible. I've been an advocate for ending this war and having negotiations for a very long time. But guess what? Vladimir Putin was open to negotiations to ending this war, and he even sent proposals that Biden's administration did not answer. They did not want to negotiate at all.
So Clint, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have only a few minutes and just a few other questions, please. Bill, and then I'll get to your question in the back. If you want to come to the mic, please? Go ahead, Bill, and I'll repeat it for you.
I'm listening to what you're saying about Russia. The thing I do not understand, though, is what they are afraid of from the European, or from NATO and the Europeans. Are they physically afraid of being attacked by them? The only people that have any history of attacking somebody else it appears to me, is probably Russia of going in militarily to other countries. NATO has not done that I'm aware of. Maybe I'm naive about that, but what are they, I don't understand exactly what they are afraid of.
Bill, could I just give some color to that? First of all, one of the things that Trump, and I give him credit for this, has been pushing is for NATO to increase their defense budget spending. So NATO, prior to this, was in no position to be attacking anybody. From an equipment standpoint, a training standpoint, they have been woefully inadequate in terms of the obligations that were set out as part of their NATO agreement and treaties. So I don't see that NATO is going to be attacking anybody. Now, can they be viewed as a threat at some point? Maybe after all is said and done now, they're going to be increasing their defense budgets. They're going to have to look at a whole series of different issues to get and reindustrialize, especially if the U.S. is not going to be supplying the equipment. So again, for time, please, I'll ask another question, and we'll see each other and have more conversation, Bill.
I was wondering, so it was laid out how important it was for Khrushchev and the Soviets that President Bush and his Secretary of State verbally and in letters promised not to expand NATO. But I find it kind of odd that we're hinging all of this on like what a couple of people said who in a couple years got voted out of office, and why Khrushchev won, like setting like making the big decision to let Germany unify, didn't ask for like an actual treaty, didn't ask for an actual like written down agreement approved by the U.S. Congress when undertaking this, because honestly it just seems like words and letters doesn't hold up.
So you're bringing up something I was going to speak to for my presentation, which is credibility and integrity. You can make a treaty is only as good as the two parties willing to abide. So there are a number of examples, including the U.S. supposed to be coming to the aid of Ukraine in the case of being attacked, i.e. we're talking about Russia, because we negotiated removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, correct? Mm-hmm. And there's countless examples of situations, Taiwan, as Tiff was alluding to. We have an agreement. I don't know if it's a treaty that has been signed necessarily by Congress, but we have a pretty binding agreement that if attacked, we will come to Taiwan's aid. Now, if you got some color on that, Tiff, please, but this is where the importance of, you know, if you're going to say something, you better be able to back it up, otherwise it's just cheap words. So, Tiff, any comments on Taiwan and the U.S. in regards to what the question is?
I mean, it's not a treaty. There's a Taiwan Relations Act, so it would be less binding. But there's decades of also precedent of the U.S. making it clear that they don't want to change in the status quo. Biden would occasionally like to throw out the fact that we would come to their defense. That's not the formal position of the U.S. government,
right,
that we would engage in military. I just have to say it to Professor Walker's earlier comments. I think when I hear that the poor Russians and other countries are being hurt, I mean, I part of it because my perspective studying China and living in China, I find that to be a little bit of a slippery slope. I mean, there are Chinese people all over the world. Obviously, they've been mistreated very sadly in many countries. There's been anti-Chinese riots. Right. But the idea, I just don't really think that Putin was so concerned about poor Russians that, in other countries. That doesn't sound right. The other thing,
you can ask the Chechens how they feel.
I don't think the fear is that Putin is, as you said, going to move into France or the UK. Right. What about like Estonia or something? I mean, there's more immediate things where there's a history of Russian in taking being in charge there, and I don't know. So I should stop there.
Because you mentioned the importance of treaties, but my question was more on because ultimately the promises of George H.W. Bush, the president, was ultimately the promise of one administration, whereas an actual treaty would be the promise of a nation. So why didn't Khrushchev demand something like that when giving up East Germany and the Warsaw Pact?
I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that question. I'm just going back to the fact that if a treaty is made, it has to be approved by Congress, correct? And that should be something that supersedes any administration that carries through to the next unless Congress in administrations yet to come make decisions to abdicate on that treaty. So this goes to a part of really understanding, which is something that's happening right now in this country, which is constitutionally, what can you or can you not do? What can you say? Well, if that's in the Constitution, I was thinking about when you were talking about Putin, he's got six terms. Maybe there's a president today that would love to have 6 terms. But constitutionally, you can't do that unless you change the Constitution. So my last words to you, because I realize it's getting late, we're hungry, we want to get home, is that we have laws that bind us as a country and a nation. It can change, it does change. But we have an obligation as citizens to make sure that we understand that we hold our officials to those laws unless we decide by vote and by the methodology that we have put in place to make those changes. So I will close with that and say thank you to all of you who have come tonight. Hope to see you soon. Take care.